Hi, everyone. I'm Jack Micah. I'm a vice president in the pricing, reimbursement, and market access part of Indegene. Thank you for joining our session today at the Indegene Digital Summit. Very pleased to be able to have two esteemed guests to help us walk through our topic, which is going to be how are market changes, such as the IRA and beyond, affecting my gross to net planning. And just to make sure that we cover the whole thing, and when I talk about gross to net planning, I'm talking about not just the difference between gross and net, but what gross is and what net is, as well as the difference between. If you got that, you're in good shape for how this session is going to go. So first things first, in thinking about how we're going to start to talk about the increasing pressure in this area, I want to bring on and have them introduce our guests, David Shulkin and Nick Simmons-Stern. David, can you just give a little bit of yourself instead of me doing you the injustice of doing it for an intro?
Sure, I'd be glad to, and I'm glad to be here with both of you today. I'm David Shulkin. I'm a physician, internal medicine physician, and I've spent most of my career running healthcare systems. I've been the CEO of places like Beth Israel in New York City and health systems in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and then more recently joined government when President Obama first asked me to come in to lead the Veterans Health Administration, the healthcare part of VA, and then I joined the cabinet as the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs in the Trump administration.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us. Nick, you want to give us a little bit of background?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Simmons-Stern. I am the head of global pricing and access at Biogen. I've been in the industry for a dozen years or so, and before that was an Alzheimer's researcher. And I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks so much. Thank you both. Can I start with just a big general question that I'll throw out to both of you? It feels to me like pricing pressure is increasing. Do you guys feel like that's the case? And if that's the case, what are the main what are the important drivers of it? David, you want to go first with that one?
Well, I think that my perspective on this is that the issue, pricing pressures have been there a long time. And you have to remember, I'm going to look at this as more of a Washington insider watching this story play out rather than an industry person. But, what's happened, and particularly the drug pricing implications of the Inflation Reduction Act, were very predictable to me. From my point of view, where you had 87% of the general public polling that drug prices were too high and unaffordable, you had bipartisan support to find a solution to drug pricing. You had my conversations with both presidents consistently that we needed to do something about drug pricing. And the pharmaceutical industry, unfortunately, relatively inflexible on their pricing models, so not providing realistic alternatives. We were going to enter into a legislative solution for this. Even in Washington, where you are better off predicting that nothing's going to happen legislatively, this was one that was going to happen. And so I think that what we're watching right now, just to make a quick couple points about this, Jack, we're watching, in my view, the biggest shift in health policy related to pharmaceutical pricing than we've seen in a long time. And this is just the beginning. That what I'm talking about is price setting. And because of the political situation, because of the lack of alternatives, frankly, that the industry has provided here, we have come to the point that health policy now is moving towards price setting. And I think that's going to have major implications. The second thing that, of course, I think about, being on the provider side of things and the government side, not necessarily from the industry, is that these implications that most people on this call are thinking about from the pharma perspective are actually going to have huge ripple effects throughout the rest of the industry. This affects health plans, this affects the providers, this affects the Medicare beneficiaries, this is clearly, I think, going to have implications in the rollover into the commercial markets as well. And third and finally, Jack, the way I look at this is what we're watching right now is really politics. This is the IRA is a political vehicle. And so that means that, you know, should the parties change in Washington, should the control of the House and Senate or the White House change, you know, we could certainly see a very different policy put in place. The Republicans could easily repeal the IRA, or at least the drug provisions of it, and the Democrats could easily expand the drug negotiation power into the commercial market, into the private market. And so what if you're a political student, you're really going to have to watch what's happening here. And I think pharma has to really start thinking about what alternative, sustainable, and realistic strategies are to price setting. And I hope we can talk about that today as well.
Thanks, David. What do you think, Nick? That sounds like increasing pressure to me.
I think it definitely does. I first have to say that everything I'll say today is my own opinion, not the perspective of Biogen. I do work in the industry, of course, and have that perspective, but I'll try to provide my own and unvarnished opinions. And I have to say, I agree with everything David said. First, with the fact that this is politics. Second, that it has been a long time coming in the U.S. And thirdly, that this is in the U.S. the most material pricing change we've seen in the legislation in many years. The thing I'll add is that this is nothing new for me, being a global pricing person. This is something that we have seen and been dealing with outside of the US for much longer. And when we talk about pricing pressure, we historically have been dealing with price setting and price regulation and price negotiation and all of these things that are being introduced to the US market, HTA, for many years outside of the US. AMNOG in Germany is over 10 years old now. Across the EU, we have expanding policy reforms and other measures which are putting increasing pricing pressure on pharmaceutical products. But that is a continuation of a trend which began many years ago. So the US is joining the fray, as it were, but this is something that is not new to the industry.
No, I agree with you on that point too, Nick. I mean, I think you guys are hitting all the topics, and I think it's interesting to me sometimes how little recognition there is that there isn't a whole lot that's new under the sun. If you look around at different countries in different ways, the pressures take on different aspects, and they get applied in different ways, but it's the same thing all around, which is people are interested in having access to medicines that are going to help people's lives, and they want to be able to do that in a way that's going to be sustainable for their economies. It's a pretty basic thing, but how people go about it and where they go, and the focus on it in the U.S. that has kind of waxed and waned with political interest over time. Certainly, I agree with David, has got a lot more interest at this point, and a lot more interest from both sides of the aisle saying we need to do something about it in a different way than had done before. So, but
well,
let's go ahead.
And Jack, you know, let me just say, I think Nick did a really nice job of sort of giving that global perspective. I'm gonna, you know, even just translate that a little bit, you know, dumb it down a little bit, because I'm probably one of the few people who have had direct conversations with the president about that exact topic that Nick's talking about. And the way those conversations go is the president says to me, look, why is it that you can get the same drug in Egypt or in a third world country or even in Europe at a fraction of the price of the US? And so unless there's a really good answer why that can happen, we understand the implications if the US wasn't paying the premium pricing that it has, and we're going to talk about those implications. But unless you really have a good answer why it's so different when you cross, you know, boundaries of states, I I think the pressure is going to remain on the industry to come up with something that actually makes more sense on how to price drugs.
And I think the reality of, purchasing power parity not being the same every place and economies being different around the world aren't everybody understands those things, but they don't give them any comfort when they say my loved one can't get the drug that they need. That changes the debate a bit, and especially when you're in an industry that's built on innovation and sometimes fantastically valuable innovation, that once it becomes so fantastically valuable, sometimes everybody thinks it should cost nothing because everybody should have access to it. So trying to find that balance is always interesting. But we've already talked a little bit about IRA. Can we go to the first slide just to give a little bit, very quick background for some folks who might not be familiar with what IRA is? The IRA was passed and signed last August. It covers a lot of different aspects, and healthcare is one of them. There are three key healthcare provisions that you can see on the slide: the inflation penalty, the cap on out-of-pocket expenses, and benefit design changes, and negotiated drug prices. At the moment, the most focus is on the negotiated drug prices, because we've had a list of which drugs they're going to be, and people are starting to get ramped up to say, hey, where is this going to go? Some of the other things are already in place and happening, though. And as David said, it's staged so that it's going to take a little while for this stuff to get implemented. So it is a bit subject to how the political winds might shift over time. So with that as a little bit of background on it, the inflation penalty part of it, well, and you know what, I'll back up a sec. We're not going to go into the details of each of these three things so much today. We'll talk a little bit at a higher level on the implications of all of them. But we have done a number of blog posts and summaries about the IRA, about each of these individual pieces and how they're rolling out. And if that's something any of you are interested in, those are available for you on the Indegene site. Or if you need it, or if you need to be pointed to anything, just let us know, and we're happy to share them with you. I'm interested in moving into the second and third topics on the slide. We can switch back off the slide if you want, guys. What do you guys think about, especially the out-of-pocket limits, which seem to be the biggest thing that up front is going to address the thing of, hey, my loved one can't afford this medicine. Well, now I'm going to limit your out-of-pocket expenses. But the way that those expenses are basically thought of being covered within the act is that payers are going to cover them. And that in theory is going to give manufacturers a bit of a windfall. Hey, we're going to get more compliance from patients over time, and they're going to pick up the bill for it. Is that really how it's going to work?
Well, I think to respond directly to that first, I think, first of all, the manufacturers have a liability in the catastrophic phase in the new model as well. Second, you're right, payers are going to be on the hook for more than what they were in the past. And it's unclear at this point how plan administrators will respond to that new dynamic. And it will be important to watch to make sure that this is having the desired effect, which is expanded access and lower out-of-pocket costs, which is, I think everyone can agree, a good thing for patients and for society. But if it means that there are new restrictions placed on access, new hurdles that payers put in place, that could end up backfiring. And I think we have to watch carefully to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, unintended consequences are always interesting to look at. Go ahead, David.
No, I was just going to say that I think that this grand experiment will end up with some unintended consequences. Theoretically, Jack, the way you described it, it should work that way. If you decrease cost sharing for patients, they should have higher utilization, particularly if they're Part D benefit, and that should lead to an improved medication adherence and compliance. That's a good thing. That's a good thing for manufacturers. That's a good thing for patients. It's probably a good thing for the total cost of care for the Medicare budget, which is frankly what this whole thing is about. Mm-hmm. The health plans, of course, as Nick said, have higher financial liabilities in this. And so that will lead to a redesign of their drug benefit. They're, looking at their formulary again, re-looking at their calculations, whether this has an impact on rebates, which today the IRA does not. But I do think that health plans will look at this differently. The good news for health plans, of course, particularly those that participate in the ACA marketplace, is that there's going to be increased subsidies of the health plan ACA marketplace to
Mhm.
boost those up. So that should help both health plans expand market share, but also give people more access to insurance. That will give people more access to drugs as well. I think what people don't think about as an unintended consequence are really the providers. The providers, particularly those physicians that are giving a lot of Part B drugs, a lot of the drugs that are on the top 10, top 20 list, or will be on the top 20 list, their income is likely to be reduced by close to 47%. Those are the doctors that are giving a lot of the infusions. That's going to dramatically change the way that they have to do practice, and may change the way that they prescribe medications as well.
Sure, sure, of course. Yep, yep. Let's turn our attention a little bit to the negotiated drugs. And can you put up the next slide, please? Just so I don't have to try to remember them here. For any of you who aren't aware, a couple of weeks ago they announced these are the 10 drugs. They were limited to 10 drugs to be subject to negotiation the first time. And this is the list of 10 that came out, with not just what the drug name is and what its common indications are, but the overall Part D spend and the number of Medicare Part D patients who are on that drug for a rolling 12-month basis. Any thoughts on this list, or surprises to you guys about kind of where this is and or thoughts on where it's headed as far as this negotiation stuff at this point, or is it too early to go too far with that?
Well, I call this list the TV commercial list. This is when I still watch traditional TV. I'm not streaming. I'm probably seeing more of these ads than I am of anything else. So it didn't surprise me. These are the popular ones. You can rank them by spend. You can, these tend to focus on older adults for the Medicare beneficiaries. And so I don't think that there are many surprises here. I think it was interesting to take a look at the list and see what manufacturers were impacted, and some of them were impacted a lot more than others, and some stayed off the list, although their chances are going to come the next round, I'm sure. But it didn't surprise me that we've already seen 8 lawsuits filed to try to block this legislation. And that's something which, if you want to, we can talk a little bit more about how that looks as well.
Yeah, I think definitely. Let's let Nick respond, and then let's go to that.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about the lawsuits and how this will play out. In response to the question about this list, I think, as David said, this is the TV commercial list. This is a list, I think, that is driven as much by politics as it is by the actual letter of the IRA law, which does dictate that the top spend drugs should be selected. And if you actually look at the top spend list, or the most recent estimates, this doesn't necessarily reflect that. There are some drugs that were left off that fall higher on the list. The thing is, those drugs have lower utilization. And so what this list represents is, there's an analysis a couple of weeks ago that showed this list represents drugs that over, I think, 8 million Medicare beneficiaries are on. Whereas if you simply took the rank ordered list, it would be roughly half of that. So this is a list that will allow the administration to point to negotiations for a broader swath, for drugs that impact a broader swath of the population. Therefore, I think there's some political motivation behind this, and there's some questions as to whether some of these will even remain eligible as generics come in, because there is the provision in the IRA that allows for exemption if there is
multi-source.
Multi-source competitor. And so I think we'll be watching that with Januvia and Stelara and others. So I think we'll see. But overall, like David said, I do think this is the TV commercial list.
But Nick, if I were a manufacturer and I didn't see myself on this list, but I was one of those high spend drugs, I wouldn't be breathing too much of a sigh of relief, because next year we get, to go to 20 drugs. And ultimately, while I think you're right, it's a good insight how these were selected for somewhat of the political messaging to the Medicare beneficiaries. Ultimately, this is about the sustainability of the Medicare Trust Fund. And with the Medicare Trust Fund now looking to go defunct, 2029 or something, and the CBO estimates of what this bill needs to save to do the payments for the things like the ACA subsidies, they're going to have to start hitting the numbers pretty hard to get those savings. So I think their days are coming.
And I agree that certainly no manufacturer is breathing easy right now looking at this list or thinking about the IRA.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Let's spend, do we need to spend another minute or two on the suits, or are we good with that?
No, I think it's worthwhile, Jack. And if you take a look at these suits, and I certainly am not a lawyer, nor do I have any expertise in this, but I can read the laws, and I've read the lawsuits. And legislation, particularly like this, is extremely good for the lawyers because they're going to be very busy creating their documents and their arguments. But I have to say, again, my uneducated opinion here is these are pretty weak suits, in my opinion. And no offense to the quality of the lawyers, because they've worked hard at this. But look, they've listed the Eighth Amendment by saying that these suits violate the clauses for excessive fines. They've stated that essentially that the fine starts at 186% of annual drug revenue. Well, you can make that argument that that's excessive. It's above the total drug revenue, but they can go up to as high as 1,900% for non-compliance with this. So, but it's not. Excessive clauses aren't that, or excessive fines aren't that sexy. Then they use the Fifth Amendment, which violates the due process, saying that the ACA is actually claiming that the manufacturer in the negotiation is agreeing to the stated price, when in fact, this is not a true negotiation. You're given an offer and you either take it or you ask for reconsideration. But ultimately, this is not one where both parties have to agree. Again, Fifth Amendment, pretty weak, but certainly a valid legal argument. And then, of course, the First Amendment, thrown in there as well too, in terms of the role of the manufacturer in this negotiation process. So I think that, they didn't throw in the Second Amendment. This has nothing to do with firearms. That's the only good thing about it. But these will work themselves through. I think they may end up resulting in some process changes, maybe some modifications, particularly if the manufacturers prevail. But I don't think, ultimately, in my opinion, that there will be a complete stoppage of this because of the legal arguments put out.
Any other thoughts you want to add, Nick, or you good?
Nothing to add on the lawsuits. I've learned to stay away from anything.
I had to at least offer you the chance, right?
Yeah.
No, that's great. That's great.
I do think it's worth, Jack, talking more about the unintended consequences, though. We started down that road, and I think it's very important to talk about unintended consequences of this law. And in my mind, there's a few key areas where we could see some negative unintended impacts on innovation. And I'll just list them off and we can go down the road with any one of them. But first is this 9 versus 13 issue and the incentive to the disproportionate incentive now to invest in biologics, which are more expensive to develop, more expensive to make, and therefore typically more expensive on the marketplace. Small molecules, there's no inherent reason why a small molecule can't be equally beneficial to patients as a biologic for any individual indication or therapeutic area. You don't need to go too far on the science side, but I think it speaks to the distorted incentive being disconnected from the reality of scientific innovation. And we're going to see, if this law remains in its current form, we're going to see the marketplace respond to that. And we'll see new investment in biologics and a disinvestment in small molecules. And I think that's worth considering what the impacts of that are.
And I think, Nick, we've already seen that, right? We've already seen a number of companies say, okay, we're reconsidering how we're going to go at some small molecules, and some people even saying we've discontinued pursuing a number of small molecules we had in the pipeline. Now, you can argue, did they do it for that reason, or was that an add-on reason to what they were doing before? But in large part, it goes to the core of what we want to preserve is the innovation at the same time as we get access to that innovation.
Exactly. There's another area too, I think critically, when we think about the impact on orphan drugs in particular. I think this is another area we need to be very cognizant of. First, because of the model in which the clock starts ticking, the minute that you get your first indication approval, you now have an incentive as a manufacturer to reprioritize your indications such that you have a larger indication launching first. Historically, the model is that you launch in a small indication, you price proportionally, and then you expand into a larger indication down the road, and your price comes down. Now, with the new model and the fact that the clock starts ticking, you're going to want to launch in the biggest indication first. And as a result, there's going to be orphan indications. There's going to be other smaller indications that get deprioritized, pushed out or off the roadmap entirely for an individual asset. And then thirdly, and again related to orphan indications, you have a disincentive to ever launch in any second indication once you launch in a first orphan indication, because you have an orphan exemption that applies if you have only one orphan indication. But as soon as you expand beyond that single orphan indication, you lose your exemption and you become eligible for negotiation. And there's an analysis out of the Tufts CBER, which was published last month, where they actually looked at the last 10 years, from 2003 to 2022, so 22 years of data. There were 282 orphan drugs approved in that period. And at almost a quarter of those treatments had at least one follow-on indication. And the vast majority of those follow-on indications were themselves for orphan indications. So in other words, if we were to have had the IRA in place during that 20-year period, all of those indications, all of those follow-on indications would be in jeopardy. All of these important studies, which led to important regulatory approvals in follow-on indications, would be in jeopardy, and patients who currently have access to these, in many cases, life-changing treatments would no longer have that access. And I think this is what we're going to see going forward. All of those investments that are done in follow-on opportunities for treatments which are initially approved in a single orphan indication are no longer, every company is now going to be thinking twice about doing those investments and making those regulatory filings. And that's going to be potentially devastating for the orphan community. And I know that there is a bill currently under consideration, bipartisan representatives, Joyce and Nickel put forth the Orphan Cures Act, which would address some of these distorted incentives. But I think we really need to think about what the impact will be on innovation in response to the IRA.
Yeah,
no, that's great.
Nick, that's a good point. I had not thought about that because, of course, the orphan drugs were excluded from the drug price negotiation. But I think this is one of those unintended consequences you've talked about. I would just add a few others. To me, this is going to actually raise initial launch prices. If I were pricing a drug initially, I would launch this at a higher price, knowing that later on I may end up having to do a negotiation, so that your time of return on investment is clearly going to be shrinking if you're a blockbuster drug. So That I think makes access more difficult to the new drugs. Secondly, I think that the indications, particularly those that impact the elderly, the Medicare plus population, this is going to have an impact on where people are going to be focusing their efforts. I think, Nick, if I heard you correctly in your introduction, you used to be an Alzheimer's researcher and now you're a pricing analyst. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Who's going to hire Alzheimer's researchers? They're going to need a lot more pricing analysts. So you were ahead of your time, I think. And then, I think your point about what you were talking about with the orphan drugs, the post-surveillance clinical trials and the studies define new indications. As you know, more than 60% of oncology products are actually now due to post-approval, post-initial FDA approval clinical studies and new indications. I think that there's going to be less of an emphasis on those types of studies. And, Jack, as you said already, I think the surveys that have been done have shown that 78% of companies have actually already made decisions about their pipeline based upon the projected impact of the IRA.
Yeah.
Completely agree with all of those points, David. I think at the end of the day, you squeeze a balloon from three sides. The fourth side has to expand. That's the pricing point at launch. There is, at least in the current model, nothing to prevent manufacturers from recouping that lost revenue on the tail end with higher prices at launch. And I think that'll fundamentally hurt patients as well.
It's interesting with that, Nick. The back to what we were talking about at the beginning of David's conversations with people with very powerful people saying, why is it cheaper over there? Then that as a solution, at least in the short term, probably exacerbates that situation, right? Because if the solution is, well, I go higher in the US because I can in the meantime, but I haven't changed what I've done overseas, that gap gets bigger. And or we're then into a world of, let's change the way it works around the world, which is kind of where we want to go to a little bit next, because at the same time as that might be the dynamic, the pressure outside the US is probably manifest itself in a whole different way already. It's already happening. It's not just in theory. So if I can stop you there, Nick, let's go to that a little bit, if that's okay. So go ahead, guys, to the slide with the headlines on it. And this is just very short 2 intro slides to this. I mean, and we decided to concentrate on Europe because we only had 45 minutes and didn't know how we were going to fit Europe and the US into it. But no, go back to the one. So what that first slide was is just, hey, there's lots of different people looking at this thing in different ways. What this slide is our analysis that says, hey, how this is, no, now you can go back. I'm sorry, I transitioned. How we think about these forces manifesting themselves, even when we're just thinking about the EU4 and the UK, are those different puzzle pieces on that next slide, right? And that basically what we've got going on is, hey, in the same forces are being applied and manifesting themselves in different ways in different countries. So in France, you're seeing products, you especially see it in oncology, where the products don't get an SMR, which says they're not reimbursable. So they never get to a price negotiation. They're never going to get on the market with reimbursement because they're judged to be non-reimbursable. Within Germany, you have the negotiation that happens under AMNOG that even just in the last 30 days has led to 3 different drugs being withdrawn either from the market or from negotiation based on what's going on. And it's been double that or more in the 6 months before it. So you're starting to see those things happen. What you see differently in countries like Italy and the UK and Spain also, although Spain is a little bit different, is, I mean, I have one UK colleague who I talked to who's a payer advisor there who's gotten to the point of saying, we're going to take every drug. You can almost charge what you want as far as the list price goes, but the net price, you're not going to like it. we're probably going to approve it, but we might ask for a 90% discount. We might ask for more than that. So they're just going at this in different ways. And I think how these things are playing out is already affecting how people think about where they go with countries, what they do, how they think about development of stuff. Nick, what kind of thoughts do you have about that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The pressures like we started with in Europe are definitely increasing as well. And so, in Germany, you have the Financial Stabilization Act, which has at least 5 different ways in which it puts additional pressure on price. New rebates for combination treatments, increasing the statutory rebate from 7 to 12%, moving the period of free pricing from 12 to 6 months. You have less time with which you can have a non-negotiated price. They move the threshold from 50 million to 30 million, which was the threshold for having an exemption for orphan indications. And that's an annual turnover rate, moving from 50 million to 30 million euros. There's a new wastage penalty. So, one after one, you're seeing new pressures, which ultimately will hit your gross to net. And if those pressures mount to a certain point, you see what you mentioned, which is that manufacturers are withdrawing from the German market, and German patients will not have access to treatments like Tabrecta, which was the Novartis treatment, which was just, I think, the most recent last week.
Right. Last one.
At the extreme, you have manufacturers like Bluebird that are pulling out of Europe entirely because of their inability to find sustainable pathways to commercialization across the European market. And it's not just Germany; it's in the UK, like you mentioned, and it's not just the NICE process and negotiation. It's also the statutory side of the market in the UK. You have the VPAS voluntary pricing agreement going up to, I think it's over 28% or near 28% this year for the first time, which itself led, when that was announced at the beginning of this year, multiple manufacturers like AbbVie and Lilly, and I think others have pulled out of that agreement entirely. So, I think, and we could go on, and even Japan, again, a traditionally, like Germany, a traditionally more lenient when it comes to pricing market, or at least they have statutory rules that allow for higher pricing. Even they are doing things like reducing the tolerance for their price premium in certain circumstances. So you layer all of that on top of I think the other thing which we could talk about, which is this global macroeconomic environment at the moment post-COVID, where budgets are pressure. There is real pressure on budgets, and that's something that everyone, not just the pharma industry, has to deal with. Governments are figuring out how to prioritize the limited funds that they have. So you layer all of this on top of it, of itself, and you get an environment around the world that is making it increasingly difficult to find a commercially viable business case for launching a drug.
I also think it was particularly interesting to me that in some proposed legislation in the EU, where they've proposed that the exclusivity period for a new drug will go from 10 years to 8 years.
Right.
If the drug's not launched in all 27 EU member states, which makes it extremely complicated, and is actually a pricing, pressure to decrease your price to get in all 27 of those states.
And I think it's even, David, all 27 states within 2 or 3 years, which if you talk to manufacturers, that's very hard, metaphysically impossible based on the way the review process works in countries.
And it essentially, Jack, again, the other consequence of that is it makes it that only really the big players can do that. Because who has the resources to be opening up 27 negotiations and do it quickly? So if you're a smaller company, it's going to make it really challenging.
Right.
Yeah.
And we all know all the innovation comes from big manufacturers, right?
Right.
No, Nick, did you have something else you wanted to say? I'm sorry.
No, I was going to bring up the EU pharma package as well. It's a really good
Great.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a very similar kind of thought process to the change in the exclusivity period in the US. It's just kind of the other side of the coin for the same thing. So I think we've got about 5 minutes left. I'm sure we could stay on and talk forever and ever about these things. What kind of final thoughts would you guys like to leave folks with? I'll ask you, why don't you go first, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a broader perspective here related to the incentive system that we as a society in the US and globally have set up. We have made a choice as a society to incentivize investment in pharmaceutical R&D through government granted periods of exclusivity, of government granted monopolies. That's a decision we made decades ago, and we are in many ways reaping the benefits of that as a society now with really miraculous treatments in a whole slew of areas. With the Orphan Drug Act, that was expanded, and now we have dozens of life-changing orphan drugs. I've had the benefit of working on one such drug, Spinraza, which is treatment for spinal muscular atrophy, which is a really incredible drug that was made possible by the incentives that we've put in place as a society. Now I think we're seeing a shift back where we're asking questions as a society. Are these the right incentives? Do we have the right period of exclusivity? Is this the right model for us? What I worry is that the changes that we're putting in place now, IRA being one of them, are going to lead to a situation where fundamentally the issue that has led to some of the political willpower here is at the end of the day patient out of pocket. And I worry that some of these changes we're putting in place are not going to have the level of impact that the public is expecting on that, while they will impact the incentives in a way that will lead to fewer drugs coming to market and fewer patients having access to those drugs. And it will take time to see how that story plays out. And I know what I'm saying is in many ways the industry party line here, but I truly believe that this is something that 10, 20 years from now, we might look back and say we made some bad decisions here in this period.
No, thanks, Nick. David, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think just two final thoughts briefly, but coming from my perspective of having run a cabinet level agency, actually, the second largest government agency, actually. Congress passes these laws like the IRA, and then they turn it over to the agency to implement it without really consulting with them. And I just want to particularly note, I don't believe CMS is at all prepared to be able to handle the complex implementation of this plan. It's not their fault. They really are just being told they have to become essentially a drug assessment center when they've never done that before. So they're going to have to start making decisions about what are equivalent drugs, who are the competitors, what are the outcomes of these drugs, what is the real world evidence coming in. They haven't done these types of things before. And so watching the implementation of this, I would not expect for this to be as smooth as necessarily people might be predicting. The second perspective I have, and the one that I think is most important for the pharma industry, is that, as I've said in a very sort of maybe too blunt way, this IRA legislation is the fault of the industry for not coming up with better alternatives for pricing. And I really hope that this is a wake-up call, because price setting is going to have all of these unintended consequences that we talked about. And it could and probably will hurt innovation, even though CBO says it won't. I do believe it will. So the alternative is, let's come up with a better strategy for drug pricing. And I happen to believe that's population health pricing based on the impact of the drug on the total cost of care of the healthcare industry. That's what's most important. And as an agency head, as secretary, I implemented that with hepatitis C drugs for veterans suffering from hepatitis C, where we purchased enough drug to cover the entire population of veterans in this country. Today, there would be 80, 90% less veterans who suffer from hepatitis C. The cost of care to the VA went down significantly with that. And now you have the framework for thinking about pricing in a whole different way that really does reward effectiveness, value, innovation without doing price setting. And so I think, I hope that this is going to stimulate a whole new level of thought about how the industry can begin to respond to this latest challenge.
A great tease for our next session, David. No, thank you both so much for doing this today. I really appreciate your time and your effort and your expertise. David, Nick, really appreciate it a lot. I hope you all the rest of you enjoyed the session. If you have any thoughts or questions, please let us know. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the Digital Summit. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.